She works on international political economy and law and domestic political economy. Today she's going to be, well, of course, is the director of one of our programs here at the Austrian workshop. So today she will be talking about information capacity implications for a new grammar of state capacity. So I will be keeping the queue, trying to also have the queue for people online. So I hope we have a great discussion. Thank you very much, everybody, and thanks to you, Jess.
Yeah, thanks, Gustavo. Thanks everybody for being here. It's nice to see you all, especially as well as everybody online. Yes, I will pull this up and we'll go from there, but a few caveats, of course. As you can see, this is kind of a far cry from environment natural resource governance. I'm working on lots of different things. This one is a fun sort of reconceptualization of state capacity that I'm working on with some folks that many of you in the room might remember, know, have heard of. So Federica Carugati, who used to be the associate director here at the workshop and is now at King's College London, is a classicist, but honorary political scientist. She's here on the call. Are you hi, Fed.
Hi, everyone.
Good to see you.
And Cyan Loyal, who was also at IU around the same time in political science, does repression and some social media stuff, and is now at Penn State and is also working on this paper with us. So all of the faults are mine, all of the great ideas are frankly there.
Of course, we can blame them too.
We might need to share this screen there.
Yes. Oh, is it not sharing yet? Okay. And get there. Oh, I don't mean to. Why are you not? That okay.
Nice.
All right. Sorry, guys. I have no information about it apparently. Okay. So we're good though. We'll just do it like this. All right. Cool. I guess the other thing to just mention is that, as you could probably tell, this is very much a work in progress. So really taking seriously the workshop dimension of the workshop. So we really would love any and all forms of questions, thoughts, responses, empirical examples that we are totally oblivious of, or other works in this area, because it is, a lot of people are thinking about this from different directions right now. And we would love to make sure that we are engaging in collective education instead of personal education, as it were. So without further ado, let me see if I can, that's right here. Information capacity. I'm going to try to keep this short, again, because I really am serious about getting your thoughts. But the motivating question behind this paper is the following. How are states changing in light of sort of digital revolution? And I'll see what I mean by that in a second, though most of you probably already have an inkling as to what we're talking about there, right? But what we're really interested in is sort of what are the consequences of that for how we think about and theorize and measure state capacity, which is a favorite topic and reliance in the political science literature, and is measured in all different ways for all sorts of purposes, often based on what data is available, sometimes well theorized, sometimes not so much. Okay, so we've got some sort of departure points that really motivated the way that we came at thinking about this. So first, what we mean by sort of the digital revolution, and I think many of you would probably agree with this, is that there's been an exponential increase in sort of the volume of data available about people. The rapidity of it sort of in terms of its communication, the number of what we might call like informational transactions. So real-time online communication, real-time economic transactions, right? Real-time monitoring of potential threats in cyberspace, for example, and the longevity of this data. So the extent to which we can store it in ways that we have in the past not really been able to in terms of the sheer volume, right? And this is because of the sort of, the extent to which digital data takes up less space, for example, than sort of tangible paper records, okay? And so a consequence of this is an increased demand in the capacity to gather this data, to transmit and be able to store it, and to differentiate, process, and analyze it, right? And sort of, I'll just unpack that a little bit, right? I'm really talking about the capacity, frankly, to transform data into information, right? So the idea that data doesn't really mean much without our capacity to put it into categories, interpret those categories, give them meaning, and then make decisions based off of that, right? And so we're calling this specifically these three things information capacity to do those three things. And we're suggesting that the capacity to do these three things actually requires enumeration, sort of observability, and sort of the capacity to count and name and enumerate the pieces or assets or individuals. It also requires a human and technological infrastructure primarily for transmitting and storing data, but also for gathering. And what we mean by technological infrastructure is probably relatively straightforward, right? We're really talking about the actual infrastructure of the internet, of information communication technology, right? The actual networks across which information moves. By human infrastructure, we're actually talking about, we're really referring here to more, frankly, a more narrow political science concept of principal agent. So the capacity to have individuals that respond to a principal request, whether it be to carry out a particular task, right? So we could think about this as incorporated bureaucracies, right? Or sort of reliable, loyal members of the state to actually carry out tasks. Okay? And then expertise, right? This is especially important here, right? But it's essentially the capacity to invest in developing expertise to differentiate, process, analyze data into information. Okay, so this is sort of the logic of how we get to, okay, we have this demand on what we are going to call information capacity, right? It actually requires these three things that I'm going to hint at and suggest actually underpin the other functional capacities of the state that we often refer to. So what am I talking about there? Right, the reason why information capacity is important is first and foremost, at least at the state level, and we're talking about information capacity of the state, I should clarify, I guess, is that it underpins the other three functional capacities of the state that we often refer to. So if we think back to Weber, and then sort of building on Weber more recently into Checo and others, there's sort of been a consensus around the idea that functionally states kind of do three kinds of things. They extract revenue, they administer or provide public goods, and they coerce or repress, use force. And we argue that, and we're not the only ones building on a long literature, that each of these functions actually also relies on information capacity of the state. Okay, so early on, in the emergence of states as we now think of them as sort of centralized administrative apparatuses, needed to be able to count and identify individuals and their assets in order to be able to extract them, with the idea that early on we think of states as being sort of a trade of extraction for security, one way to think of revenue for security, right? And so early on, we can even think about the sort of lack of information about in local areas and capacity to extract from agricultural production, right? We're leading states and central leaders to have to rely on like tax farmers who had more local information, right? And were able to extract accordingly, right? This is also true in light of the digital revolution, although the demands are greater, right? Especially as we see more economic transactions, more highly mobile capital, the capacity to monitor and gather information about these economic transactions is both higher and there's a higher bar for meeting it, right? The capacity to do so requires a lot more on the part of states. Okay. Administration is also contingent on information capacity, right? So we can think about it, it being very helpful to know and document who the citizens are within a polity in order to either target public goods provision, welfare services, a wide range of things that we think of the state as sort of as doing. And we could even think about this, like now in real time, using data, you're using information capacity to the extent to which states have invested in it to do things like respond to natural disasters, right, in ways that they couldn't have done so before, right? You can now text and say, this is what happened to me in this hurricane, or, for example, in a horrible earthquake, right, that we're all sort of maybe watching right now in Turkey and Syria, right? A high information capacity state and can receive that data and ideally target responses accordingly. Okay. And coercion, which in this we wrote about a little bit in an edited volume with Scott about how how coercion also relies on information capacity, right? You need to be able to identify and know potential threats, both internal and external, to leaders. And there's now more data, right? That doesn't necessarily mean more information without the capacity to process and analyze it. But also, one of the things that's interesting here, right, is that technological infrastructure is now also a new threat space, right, as well. So it's not just that it is a tool for monitoring threats, but now we have cyber threats that exist that because infrastructure now exists in digital space, there's now the option to now threaten that. Okay, so hopefully I've at least given you a superficial argument to suggest that information capacity is really, really important for the traditional functions of the state. But interestingly, the literature that talks about state capacity doesn't really focus or theorize very heavily about information capacity as a functional capacity of the state. And so we've got these three things, right, that information is very, very important for. It's also, we want to argue that it's also the case that information capacity is actually a fourth functional capacity of the state. And we can think about this in the extent to which, like, if we think about functional capacities of the state as being tools of governance, ways that leaders stay in power, now we often see leaders gathering information for exactly that goal that is not directly tied to one of these three other functions. So I think in the paper I referenced the sort of amount of money spent on polling and getting digital polls for leaders ahead of elections, right? This is directly aimed at staying in power without these additional functional capacities. So that's one example of how we're thinking about information as a fourth and independent functional capacity of the state, right? As well as underpinning these other three. Okay. So what? Right? I can tell you all that I think information capacity is really important. We can define it in these ways and say that it underpins all these other functional capacities, but why should we care about just naming this thing? Right? That's fun to write about, but that's probably not enough. Okay, so here are the reasons why we think it's important to think both independently about state capacity, about informational capacity, to define it clearly, and to sort of really seriously theorize it, especially in light of more data, more rapid transactions, and greater sort of demand for processing that data. Okay. So first, we often, at least in the literature, talk about state capacity more generally, and we're not really great at talking about state capacity for what. Capacity is only relevant in as much as it allows you to achieve a particular set of goals. If you don't define what those are, it's not clear what the relevant, what you're actually looking at. Okay. And so if we start thinking clearly about what we mean by the different dimensions of state capacity, right? Both the three that I've sort of talked about, administration, coercion, and extraction, we add this additional dimension of information to help us think about whether what we're already measured is actually information capacity as opposed to these other things, which it turns out, it often is. There's some really cool papers coming out that have like really old cadastral records of individual like sort of registration at the state level, but used to talk about extraction or coercion without sort of an explicit understanding that this is actually the capacity to gather and record data about your population. It's a slightly different thing, right? And so we might be missing something by mismeasuring it. And it might reveal particular trade-offs that we, or might bring sort of some clarity, some particular trade-offs that we might care about, right? So trade-offs between legibility of assets and taxation. Right? So in other words, if we know more about the assets that are on the ground and that states can tax, that might be great. But the capacity to tax those might not be the necessary, or might not be the next step. In other words, legibility also then leads to a demand for property rights, which actually might lessen the actual amount of tax revenue that states get. Right? So, and that's a trade-off we might not see if we're not thinking very clearly about the difference between the capacity to extract and the capacity and then sort of information capacity as a pure capacity. Okay. I'm happy to talk more about these. Mobility evasion, right, is a straight up sort of tax haven story, right? As there's more economic transactions and fewer national, it's harder to measure these economic transactions because they're moving across borders, right? You then have this, mobility, more transactions, therefore potentially higher taxing, but also easier to evade. So other additional trade-offs. And the democracy transparency trade-off comes from thinking about the, and Fed's going to probably correct me here in a second, but thinking about sort of ancient states and the extent to which early on, the sort of transparency of production, the ease of extraction, particular agricultural extraction, actually undermined the development of democracy because you didn't need to rely on local autonomous actors to participate. And so they didn't have this sort of emerging power in relation to a leader that would actually allow for the development of democracy later on. Okay, so our second, so that was a very long so what about measuring state capacity that actually didn't make it into the paper. So thanks for indulging me there. The second part is about the state's loss of comparative advantage. And this is actually an argument that we are developing for a popular piece as well that sort of suggests that information capacity, that states have lost a comparative advantage when it comes specifically to information capacity. They are not the best at gathering, storing, and processing data. And that has consequences for the other three capacities that we might care about, all right? And it also leads us to think about how states deal with it. Is it the case, right? So we're seeing states engage with non-state actors, engaging in sort of bargains to do that for them, to get data and then process it for them. So we can think about these instances of coercion where the state needs access to individual data that has to go through the tech company to get it, right? Because it cannot do it itself. You can't, this is not a thing you can easily compel. Okay. A third, so what? Autocracies versus democracies are likely to address losing comparative advantage in informational capacity and the other capacities as a result. And they're likely to address it in different ways. We do see China, like for instance, hiring local coercive actors that are actually private actors with the underlying assumption, although it's not quite explicit in much of the literature, that they have more local information and therefore can act more effectively. I'll come back to the co-opting non-state actor if that's of interest to folks, but it also relates to how democracies versus autocracies might interact with non-state actors who hold more information and have this capacity that they do. And finally, this is what I mean by implications for a new grammar of state capacity, which is to say that these things that underpin information capacity to enumerate the required infrastructure required to gather and process data, and the expertise invested to process it actually also are, if you think of the main components of the other three functions. So there's a lot here that we are still working to unpack, in part because, again, we've been thinking through these ideas with the sort of explicit in the back of our mind. So of this sort of, so what are all the different things that this might have implications for? And so those might be separate papers, they might not. But the sort of the questions and ideas that we are still thinking about and wrestling with, and really especially love your thoughts on, have to do with thinking about this autocratic versus democratic development of information capacity, who might develop it in-house versus outsourcing it, and why that might be the case. Thinking about information capacity as an independent functional capacity, you buy it. Maybe not, maybe you don't think that that's a helpful distinction. Other works we've missed that are doing similar things that we just, craziness of writing, missed. And then some more empirical examples. Right now, this is very clearly a conceptual paper, sort of trying to work through how these pieces sort of fit together. But we are also really interested, it seems to me that one empirical outcome would be to think about, are there results that we have about state capacity, what drives state capacity development, what the consequences are of it, that change if we measure state capacity differently, or if we take seriously the extent to which information capacity underpins the traditional ways in which we think about what states do. All right. 20 minutes, it was a little longer than planned. All right.
Okay, so the queue is open. Mike, there is somebody in the chat. Unfortunately, I cannot see. We'll start with Mike.
Okay, Jessica, I'm really glad to see you taking on such a big topic and getting into this. And I think that's going to be a really good project for the three of you. And you bring some nice alternate, complementary skills to this. But let me give you some comments. I don't know exactly how many comments are here, but I'll try to get the highlights. For my former life, I used to teach undergraduate, okay, back in the day. And my favorite course was one on national security and intelligence. And I think you guys could learn a lot by looking at the intelligence community in the United States and in more of a comparative perspective. Because those they are information specialists, and they're specialists at building capacity. Intelligence community not just collects information, they don't just have spies, they build satellites, they build incredible technology to analyze it. The NSA is still a pretty major actor. And when you talk about the state losing capacity, comparative advantage to private sectors, it's hard to find out what's going on in the NSA. It used to be called no such agency, but they, I think, are still pretty competitive at the high level of the technical stuff. Maybe not, I don't know, but that would be my go-to guess. I was struck in when you define what intelligence capacity means to you, it was almost exactly the way I described what intelligence does for foreign policy and military. I mean, it's everything. All the steps you have in there are in the intelligence organizations. And that might give you a nice example of the effect of technological revolution. When I was teaching, they have human intelligence, they have, geez, I can't even remember this stuff. It's been so long. Remote sensing information and technical information, electronic information. And they also had something called open source intelligence. They didn't give much attention to back in the day. Now I think that's pretty important, okay? It's because of the ways they can get information from different ways. And another thing that relates to your implications, the intelligence communities have always been sort of engaged in nefarious ways with private actors and civil actors. I mean, they're part of their business. So there is certainly a part of the state that already sort of knows how to do this co-opting and stuff like that. So I think I'm trying to resist the temptation to go full Vincent on you, but I'm going to. What do you mean by state? Okay. And
That's what you're gonna say.
tend to treat the state as a single actor. And when we all know this perspective that, there's zillions of actors. And the intelligence community is sort of the greatest example of that. I mean, that's kind of sometimes called a state within a state or deep state or whatever. But they're intelligence experts. But then there's all these other organizations that are experts in different sorts of things. And why the intelligence community is a great example in there is that one of their most difficult problems is not just gathering and evaluating information and communicating to policymakers, it's sharing information among themselves so that they can use it in an effective way. And you don't talk anything about the coordination problem that is critical to, I think, what you're calling in information capacity would have to involve some collaborative capability of getting experts within the state, within the government officials together to communicate. And there may be some lessons from that in the way the intelligence community has dealt with it. The lessons may be how not to do it, because that's still a big sort of problem. But I really think that's an area you might explore to think about that sort of analogy. And I think the final point I'd make on this is when you talk about comparing democratic and autocratic responses to this, I think back again to the intelligence communities. There's really no simple comparisons or contrasts that can be made about the way different intelligence agencies work. They kind of all look the same, whether they're run by democratic governments or autocratic governments or totalitarian governments or you name it, because it's kind of intrinsic in the nature of the business that they're doing. And again, they're information specialists. They face different problems, different reactions, but they all kind of have the same problems, but there's, as far as I can tell, there's no distinguishable regularity. So I think you're going to have trouble making that case. Maybe it'll be a little easier in sort of this above ground rather than the below ground kinds of things. But don't expect that there's going to be clear contrast between how autocratic and democratic governments respond to information changes, technological. My gut reaction, my gut expectation would be there's not going to be a clear distinction between how those governments are. So if you find some, you would surprise at least one of the people who'd probably be reading it. So I very much encourage you to go into this. And if you have any questions about where to sort of on this, I'll be glad to give you some.
Want to
Really quick, I will definitely take you up on the literature suggestions there. The NSA point is a really, really good one. The way that we're thinking about that is the extent to which you can develop it in-house, you still face potential backlash when people find out. So Snowden, et cetera, right, requires new forms and I didn't say this in the presentation, new forms and sources of legitimacy for thinking about what the boundary, what states are entitled to, right, in terms of building that up. Still a super great autocracy, democracy thing. I want to put, there's a little bit of work right now suggesting that autocracies are going to be much better at centralizing and gathering data and this sort of information capacity. It's not well documented empirically, but that argument is out there, particularly by philosophers. So that's sort of what was driving us to think about, okay, why would that be the case? Or would we just expect democracies to do something different? I suggest that if autocracies are focused on repression, that might mean building up different kinds of information capacity than if democracies are more focused on legitimacy through public goods provision, right? And so that might lead to different strategies of building it up, but it's not been fully fleshed out yet. So to your point. All right.
How that goes.
Yeah.
Okay, I go to the chat because always we forget about people following online. So I think we have one question in the chat, and then I have Barb and Travis, I think in that order, if I got it right. So we see the question in the chat. Yes, do you want
Yes.
to react to that?
So thank you very much, Sandra, for your question. I do not have an answer for this.
You might read what the question is.
Sorry. Okay. So the question is, everything has been said so far seems to assume that the information gathered is somehow true. How do states address the ways in which false information undermines not only information capacity, but every other form of capacity? And this is a really great question. And I welcome people's thoughts and sort of ideas about this. I can, off the top of my head, right, I could see it sort of creating all sorts of problems of legitimacy particularly. But in terms of sort of thinking about the parts and how we sort of might theorize about this, we haven't gotten there yet. So I really take your point to heart, Sandra, and also sort of, I think we had talked a little ahead of time about a particular book I might consider reading. So I will look into that. I'm looking forward to it. And Cage of Reason, that also looks great. So thanks very much for that question. We'll get there hopefully.
Barb, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi,
Yeah,
Jessica.
thanks.
It's Barb.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you. When I read your paper, I was struck by the fact that there's a whole historical context that's not acknowledged here that I think is really critical for your analysis. And that is the fact that starting in the 19th century with the development of new network infrastructure technologies, railroads, telephone, and telegraph, already the relationship of these new technologies and the fact that the government did not have a comparative advantage in these technologies is already underway. And the digital revolution that you're talking about now is just further layered on top of that. And so you need to go back to these earlier technological developments and the governance structures that already were being developed to try and deal with this. For example, with telephone and telegraph, different nations struggled with whether or not they should nationalize and own the infrastructure itself, or whether it should remain in private corporate hands. And if it did remain in corporate hands, then they had to develop a whole regulatory structure to kind of deal with this relationship of the power that these corporations had to build and run these technologies and what the impact was going to be on the public. That in turn led to the creation of regulatory agencies. Well, first of all, it led to the development of a new body of law called public utility law by the states. It led to the development of the creation of state regulatory agencies, eventually federal regulatory agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is a predecessor of the FCC. That also led to new bodies of law, the statutory version of antitrust, because the common law version was viewed as inadequate. And as technology kept evolving in the information technology space, the laws had to keep adapting and evolving, including, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which itself is already perceived as outdated by further technological evolution. So it would seem to me that I'm not as familiar with all the literature that you are tapped to. Of course, I am with Douglas North, and stuff like that. But in the political science space, I do know, in talking with some colleagues of mine in political science, they have often told me that in the political science space, the real understanding of telecommunications regulation history is not as well developed and understood. And that seems to be a missing piece here, because a person familiar with that history would say, well, this isn't new. It's just further evolving, that's all. So that's just a suggestion. And if we want to talk further about that, but the whole issue about the struggle about monitoring information, and this includes the 19th century, even with the telegraph, and the fact that telegraph companies had possession, it was influencing presidential elections and things like that. I mean, the fact that these telegraph companies had certain information, and then it was politically determined when certain things were going to be released or not. I mean, a lot of these things we've seen before. And it's just, yes, it's true. The digital technologies is making it more complex, as to the complexity of it. But at its heart, this is something we've been struggling with for quite some time. So that's my suggestion.
I will definitely take you up on that literature, Barb. I should also be clear. We also want to agree with you that we're not suggesting there's something new here fundamentally, and that states all of a sudden need information. We're suggesting that the demand has increased in particular ways. But I think that there's a lot that we could do to think about comparative cases. We think all the way back, given sort of Fed has a really wonderful sort of expertise and understanding of ancient states and the sort of, there were fewer people and sort of fewer complexities. And so thinking through the nature of these relationships in that context is really illuminating. But to your point, sort of thinking about the Industrial Revolution and how it also created a particular new constellation of sort of relationships between states and non-private and non-state actors for managing these new technologies, I think could be a really useful interlude between ancient Greece and now.
Yeah, well, and certainly as it is like with any, geological or archaeological dig, you've got to be cognizant of the layers. And all I'm saying is that we've got to, so that was just something that it struck me that it could use some acknowledgement of the underlying layers that we've already been struggling with these large companies.
Okay, so Travis, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm going to drive off what Barbara and Mike have asked, but also go back to what Sandra had mentioned. Yes, I also assume that you're describing information as good information, the way you have this structured. So I'll just leave it at that. But let me run Barbara's idea historically back a lot further and mention what Mike said. Information gathering from states in terms of espionage or sort of SIGINT, surreptitiously gathering information, doesn't seem to have changed a great deal since just been developed since for the last 2,500 years. I mean, you can look back at Persian history or warring states in China history. So I think that you want to consider whether states, and again, as Mike said, you've got to define states, whether states have ever wanted to have a comparative advantage or even pursued comparative advantage. Comparative advantage means that they're giving up something, that their expertise in doing one thing is not as strong as perhaps expertise in another on a comparative basis. Really, I think you're talking about competitive advantage. They no longer have a competitive advantage in a lot of information gathering. So you might want to go back and look at the definitions of comparative advantage and ask yourself, what is the state, the prototypic state giving up in terms of, I can't do this function, I'm spending too much on information gathering instead of something else. Then the second thing is, I couldn't understand the difference between taxation and predation when you were looking at comparisons. Yeah, there's a trade-off, but maybe I'm not understanding taxation in the sense that you're talking about taxation, because you started talking about offshore, or you started talking about tax shelters, et cetera. And I couldn't quite follow that. I have other things, but I'll just send them to you, Jess, because I think there's a lot to unpack in your paper and in this idea. So I'll send some stuff to you via email. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Travis. I appreciate it. And I think the historical context is well noted here. And I want to sort of think, we need to, I think, be more clear that what we are really trying to do that's new is theorize more explicitly about this capacity, less to say that it is a new capacity. That is not what we want to argue at all. But that doesn't undermine the importance of thinking historically about how this capacity has looked and what that means. I will just say really quickly about the comparative advantage point. That is language taken directly right from our traditional definition of what the state does, which it has a comparative advantage over the use of force. Also been labeled a monopoly over the use of force, right? As you point out, those are actually two different things, but this is not really how we have not, as political scientists, grappled, I don't think, very much with that. So I think that's a really good point to bring out, because I think we can do that, right? We can sort of say, are we really talking about comparative advantage? Are we talking about sort of monopoly over, or are we talking about competitive advantage to point out? So I think it's a really good point, and actually something that's, we can speak to later and then sort of.
May I possibly add one thing to this?
Yeah.
So the question is, so Mike brought up SIGINT and information gathering. The question is, how can we even understand whether a really well-functioning state, let's say China or the United States, is ineffectively gathering information. They're not going to tell us, whereas a commercial entity wants to make more money from information gathering. That's just my thought. Thanks. And this is a great topic. I'm glad you're addressing this.
Thanks, Travis.
Edu?
Thank you. Thank you, Jess. Great presentation. As Mike said, I think this is a wonderful research program and I guess a long-term one.
That's right.
So I have few comments. First, you know what is coming to mind when I was reading your piece was Benedict Anderson's Imagined Commune. You know, talking about the rise of the printing press, you know, and the rise of nationalism. And you don't dialogue with that, and you may or may not select. But the parallels there could be interesting to explore, you know, to think about what are the larger consequences of this process. And so that it could be a parallel there that you can consider. Second point, similar to Mike's, I mean, the use of state, I think, too broadly, particularly, I think, differentiating from political groups that appropriate the state at different times and make that connection between, you know, data or information as part of the state and the use of that by the controllers of the state. One third point, I think you're using data and information interchangeably. And I think that's a significant part of the issue that you are dealing with. And you know, how data is transformed into information is the political process in this whole story. So I would sort of, you know, from the beginning, kind of open up that box, you know, what's data, what's information, what are the processes that connect them? And yeah. In terms of example, one example that comes to mind is the Brazilian program on deforestation monitoring, which is a capacity that developed over 30 some years, an incredible capacity. Really interesting. I mean, I think it fits all your three criteria there very well. And it's also a program where you can explore how data and information are manipulated to you know, data it's totally political. I mean, you can reinterpret that data to show or to hide something. And that example shows that very well. So that's a potential example too.
Can I respond to this, what is the state thing that kind of keeps really quickly? Because this is the perennial question, right? It's sort of like what your departure point is, right? Is how you are thinking about the state. And for us, I think because in part of the long history in our sort of, particularly the long history, you know, that is ensconced more in sort of the ancient world, but also sort of ontologically, right? How does the state as we think of it emerge? Right? Some of that is a reciprocal process, right? What we think of the state is reflective of what exists at a particular point in history and vice versa. And so, you know, this question of tax farming, for example, early on, those actors could later be co-opted to be part of the state or not, right? And that to me is a question of the evolution of how the state changes over time. And so to me, it then suggests that if we're going to talk about questions of like, you know, how much do we think that the state as it currently stands relies on Google or Apple or whatever for its information needs, does that then suggest at some point we should expect the state to attempt to co-opt actors in this space to become part of the state? And so the point is very well taken, right? That we are taking a 100,000-foot version of what the state is, as in it is a somewhat coherent organization, an entity that carries out these three, and we were arguing for functional capacities in a way with a particular end in mind, which is staying in power, frankly, as a governance tool. But we're not saying much more than that, in part because of this reciprocality. That doesn't really help us out of the quandary that much, other than to say we actually want to investigate these questions about who is brought in and co-opted and who is not, and why, and what that says about how states are addressing the needs that they have to stay in power. So that's a great point, and we need to be clearer about how we're thinking about that, I think.
Scott, and then I will insert myself.
We do.
Go.
Yeah. It was just on that last point, Jess, because I feel like we are seeing in this geopolitical moment more countries forcing some of these companies to take sides, basically, right? More traditionally, that was data localization laws, but now it's supply chain issues. There's trade issues that are kind of interlinked there. I was trying to think in your spectrum of how you would fit in like public-private partnerships and state-owned enterprises as well, because there's a whole range here beyond just, how governments rely on contractors to do some of these tools, right? So as you're kind of thinking through different case studies, I love the Brazil example, but one other one that came to mind was these ISAOs, these information sharing and analysis organizations that the Obama administration really tried hard to basically create to spread. They didn't go very far, but now the Biden administration is really doing it again. And the first one they're doing is research and education. And I use home to the RIN ISAC, which is like the Information Sharing and Analysis Center for all of higher ed. So it could be an interesting case study as they go from a sector-specific organization to this much broader one, working hand in hand with government, what barriers they're seeing. And they work across the 5 eyes too, not just the US. So
Well, thank you. Yeah, those would be really
it
helpful.
could be a unique data set anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really helpful suggestions. I think thinking about the
Yeah.
different ways in which those relationships can look.
Mm.
Okay, so.
May I offer a comment just to pick up on that discussion? Just real quick.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, it's also the understanding the history of procurement. Okay, long history of the government depending upon the private sector for procurement. A lot of this stuff with AT&T and stuff, that goes back and essentially reliant on a lot of the R&D that was, for example, Bell Labs, all of that. There's a long history of the military, everything relying on these private companies for procurement. I mean, all of this stuff feeds in, but it seemed like your theme was you're specifically wanting to focus on the effect of the digital technology. But I don't know to what extent you're interested in digging into that, and that maybe picks up with some of what Mike was saying too about in terms of intelligence operations and things like that. But there's a long history too of the government being dependent on in its procurement process for a lot of these technologies because it just can't possibly supply it itself.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Okay, so I was thinking, so my first comment is related to more theoretical understanding of data and information. So you may think that any organization that needs to make decisions, we will be collecting, storing, and using information, okay? So I think the key interesting question there is, what is the kind of the game that determines how they collect, use that information, storage that information. So it could be very nice to have that as a reference point, and that could happen at the firm level, local government level, state level, whatever, any organization, even at the household level, you have that issue. It would be interesting to have some insight of under what circumstances you have efficient or inefficient outcomes there. Under what circumstances you have under collection or over collection of information. Under what circumstances you have like a good use according to the goals of this organization of information, or to what point if this information goes against the goals of this organization. No? So that would be like from my point, like point one. And then point two, I would say, okay, these are the specificities when you talk about the political organization, meaning the state, right? And then there, so connected with that is like, I would like to see what are the differences, okay? And then with these changes in technologies, another thing that you can explore is the differences in the comparative advantages of different forms of organizing the same thing, because now there are different costs and benefits of collecting information for different organizations. So let me put this in a brutal way. So if you go and think about the discussion of the old discussion about the economics of why communism didn't work, right? And you go and read Use of Knowledge in Society by Hayek, and the problem is that the state cannot properly use the information to allocate resources at the economic level. That's Hayek's reasons against socialism. Okay? Is this changing because of the availability of information or not? Or so, like, are we changing the boundary between, private sector and the state because of this or not? So you see, that probably at a very high level, you don't want to, but at different levels, you may play around more or less the same things like the quotient question. What's the limit of one form of organization versus another? What's the limit of local governments to national governments with this? Okay, so that would be the way of thinking about this that I would consider. No, and in that sense, I don't know. Maybe this statement about the state is no longer the most effective actor gathering, storing, and processing information. I don't know. You have to think about that at the margin, no? Like, who is expanding its role in this dimension? Who is contracting its role in this dimension somehow? No? So, again.
I do not have a good response.
I do. I do.
I think this question is interesting.
I do. I do.
That's very
All right, Fed, your turn to go.
No, Gustavo, sorry to sort of interject, but you laid out exactly what we think is the research agenda here that this paper is meant to explore. I think that in simple terms, and you guys have suggested many ways in which the simple terms have to be complicated, which is of course very welcome. But in simple terms, the state, the modern state, is that entity that created a bureaucracy in order to get stuff done on a variety of different levels, of which, summarizing, for the work of social science, we talk about coercion, extraction, and administration of various kinds. So you're exactly right in saying that this is not the first time that the state gathers information. It's not the first time that it does it in one way or another. It's not the first time of anything, right? It's like, I love you guys. Like Asian historian here is like, yes, no, history matters. Like that's a very important point. But I think that while by conceptualizing information capacity as we're trying to do, and by suggesting that we should sort of like conceptualize and measure information capacity and the implications of the state's use of information on other capacities, on other functions. The questions that you're raising, Gustavo, are exactly the questions that I think we should start asking. What types of organizations are not just the most efficient, but also the most legitimate, right? Because there's a difference between Facebook and the US government or the US military on whether and how, on what responsibility for what legitimate reasons or not information is gathered and how. And of course, this has repercussions on regulation and regulatory practices, as Barbara was pointing out. So this is all super welcome, and I just brazenly took this opportunity to say hi to everyone.
Can I have a follow-up there? So it's like, I think in polyscience, you have all this literature of bureaucracies and the transmission of information within bureaucracies. I know the person that I know is John Patty that had a book on that. I'm sure it's not the first one. So it's like, it's given my limited knowledge of that field. So that probably is something interesting to think about, because as you can think about the state as a bureaucracy, as Federico was saying, and then, the main role of bureaucracy is like, or one role is like, well, collecting information and using that information, but there is a strategic transmission of information within the bureaucracy to final policy makers or not, how we should arrange things for this to happen in the most effective or legitimate way, depending on
and your first point, I think we have kind of internalized. We're sort of, the people that we're sort of speaking with, or at least building on, or, David Savage and others thinking about like the development of a dependent bureaucracy as in some ways a responsible information gatherer. But we haven't quite, as Fed sort of points out, like, right, we would like to get to this next point of thinking about, the sort of politics of information exchange within that actor and whether it's the most efficient and legitimate actor for doing those particular functions, given what we think of as information capacity. So yeah, for super good points.
I'm fine. No, go.
Just very briefly, and I say thank you. Second, I haven't read the paper. You're getting cold thoughts quickly off top of my head, but just so you know, this can be useful as an experiment. I mean, not sure it's helpful. What makes me, the first thing I was thinking about is I was thinking ethics and propaganda studies. Some of them, I'm thinking about the connections of these things in some way, but that's not worth talking about. Also, this is right now, this is a cross-disciplinary piece of work here. It's very large. I was struck, I love the so what framing. The human capacity point you named, I believe, is interesting. Whatever that may mean to what you're searching for. And that takes me a little bit to public administration, public management. You think about, and I'm thinking students are in Eleanor and Vincent's house. I'm thinking rules on paper. I'm thinking a bit nested states even a little bit. And I think about the combination of those things and what those applications that may have, maybe are not for the research you're now doing, but perhaps therefore, so what? It's interesting to me without having thought about it, without having read your paper.
Well, without having thought about or read your paper, I still think you're maybe 5 steps ahead of where we are, which is a testament to you and no. So human capacity, we were initially thinking of it both in terms of as expertise development within the state, right, and having to invest in what that means, but also as the idea, very much this point of like the state is not necessarily a single unified actor and has to rely on responsible agents within the state to actually perform tasks associated with information gathering. But I think, your other points will require a little bit more reflection and thinking about sort of these broader implications for the other ways in which we think about how states and organizations are frankly institutionalized and how we think about that. So I've written them down. I want to think a little bit more on them. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to add no worries. Just wanted to add a footnote. There are 16 different intelligence gathering agencies within the US government. They don't agree on how to classify or not classify information. They tried to create a common encyclopedia by incentivizing people, giving them credit for information they would put on their classified encyclopedia. I think they've failed. But this would be a really good project for some graduate students. Using, applying what you've done.
Send them my way.
Related to her very interesting comment. So top literature, essentially, you want to have a lot of experts, independent experts. It's much better for the policymaker. I know that sometimes you are just replicating the same thing. You are paying the cost of replication, but then they have much less incentive to lie to you or to bias information that they are transmitting. So it's like that's another theoretical tool that you can bring to the table. So it's like.
I think Mike behind you had a question.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. I wanted to jump on the bandwagon that Eduardo started and just push environmental data as I think,
especially given
a useful way to explore this stuff empirically, and in terms of an important answer to your question of so what, especially in the sense that it divides autocracies and democracies in some pretty interesting ways. The empirical example that came immediately to mind is the political status of water quality data in China, since China is already sort of on your radar. But I don't know a lot about this, but I have heard as an aside a couple of times that water quality data is a state secret. So I think the way that the paper currently sort of talks about information in general and then personal information as an example, but I think that environmental information might be a third pole worth looking at.
How I missed that given.
It's a great example.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate
Yes, you have like 10 seconds.
10 seconds.
All your research.
This was so wonderful. It was really both enjoyable and illuminating, especially in all the different ways which we have yet to think about this. So that's really, really great. Fed, do you have anything you want to add?
No, thank you. Thank you all very much. This has been wonderful. And hello to everyone. I miss you.
Yes,
We
and,
miss you.
and yes to Jervin. I love Jervin, and also Soifer, also love his work. So yes, those are folks that are on our radar. I don't know who that's from. I guess I could look.
Lauren.
It is, yes. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you,
Hi,
Lauren. I
Lauren.
appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much.
And yeah, thanks to everybody for engaging, for reading. It's early.